And
this meeting is being recorded.
Right. Bear with me for a moment. Okay.
Yep.
Everyone can see that, I hope. And well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. I love Peterborough and the area for a whole bunch of reasons. The geology is part of it, the beautiful landscape, and Peterborough is a really nice town. I live in Guelph, and Peterborough reminds me of Guelph, and vice versa. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Niagara Escarpment. It's a feature that's close to my heart. It's close to my home as well in Guelph, but and when I was working with the Bruce Trail Conservancy, I was also a volunteer for 12 years prior to becoming the CEO. So I really, it's sort of in my blood. So I'm happy to talk about that and hopefully put it into a little bit of context for where you are as well. So we'll get started. This is where you are in the Southern Ontario world. But you probably know the Niagara Escarpment, even if some people think they don't. Most naturalists do, because you're smart, savvy people who go to all kinds of great nature places, but not everyone does. So if you've been to Flower Pot Island up by Tobermory, you've been on the Niagara Escarpment. If you've been to the ski hills at Blue Mountain, or if you've been to the beautiful Beaver Valley and seen Kimberley Rock, you've been to the escarpment. There's the 401, not very elegant, but it passes right through the escarpment at Milton, where you can see ski hills on one side, the ski hills at Glen Eden. In Hamilton, the city is built on the Niagara Escarpment. We have an upper and lower. They call it the mountain. It's hardly a mountain, but it is a bit of a geographical blockage in some areas, but fabulous geology in Hamilton. And the wine region of Niagara is on the Niagara Escarpment. The escarpment itself provides a microclimate that's really great for not just grapes, but also a lot of the tender fruit as well. You can see some beautiful blossoms there, and I think they might be just like that right now. So beautiful place to be. And of course, Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls is falling over the Niagara Escarpment. It's worn its way back from the escarpment edge over the last about 10,000 years. But it is the Niagara Escarpment that creates that ledge over which the falls come. So you've probably been on the Niagara Escarpment. There's almost no doubt about that. And in fact, I'm going to talk about the Niagara Escarpment in Southern Ontario, but this red shaded line shows you that the Niagara Escarpment actually forms a bit of a horseshoe right up the Bruce Peninsula onto Manitoulin Island, and then around through the Door Peninsula in Wisconsin and right down. In fact, there is actually Niagara Escarpment down below Lake Erie in Michigan, but it's so buried in glacial till, all the material left behind by the glaciers, that it's buried. But there have been some research papers on the escarpment. It's just several hundred feet under the sand and gravel, so it's there, but not very visible. So let's cast ourselves back a long time ago, around 450 million years ago. What we had was the collision of, I'm going to talk about the continents in their present day names and configuration, but they actually was quite different back then. But we had a proto-North America, and then we had a whole bunch of small sort of island terrains, if you will, little pieces of continent, bits of what would become Africa, all pushing together and shoving up a massive mountain range. It was being pushed up along the edge of the eastern seaboard. We know it nowadays as the Appalachian Mountains, but it was a mighty, mighty mountain range way back then. I'm saying eastern seaboard, but in fact, the whole continent of North America at that time was lying on its side, and where we are today was straddling the equator. Actually, we're about 10 degrees south latitude. So eastern seaboard was actually the southern seaboard, but that gets really confusing. So we'll just go with present day configuration. This is another way of looking at it. This is a diagram that I borrowed from a really terrific book called Manitoulin Rocks. And it shows you what the North American continent looked like way back when. So the Ordovician is a major era, 488 to 444 million years ago. And then the Silurian is from 444 million years ago to 416. These big geological eras, the Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, etc., are separated by extinction events. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But these are the two main periods of time that the escarpment straddles. And you can see that most of the continent was underwater under a shallow tropical sea. That's important because there's lots of life in those seas. There's no life on land, or not any complex life. There's algae and things like that. But there were lots and lots of creatures in the oceans, in this shallow tropical sea. And we've got this big yellow dot called the Michigan Basin. Now, just like land surfaces, sea beds and ocean beds are not flat. They've got lots of high spots and low spots and pockets and things like that. There was a pocket right around where the Great Lakes are now, called the Michigan Basin. It was just a roughly circular depression. It may have been caused actually by a meteorite impact something like 2 billion years ago. There's been some research done on that. But however it got there, there's a circular basin. And what was happening is these mountains were being pushed up along the eastern seaboard, along the Proto-Appalachian Mountains. Sediments were spilling off of those mountains into this shallow tropical sea and filling up this low spot, this Michigan Basin. And that's how we get layers of rock in southern Ontario. This early mountain range was really, really big. So here's a nice little graphic that shows you relative sizes. So we have the Appalachians of today in the dark green at the bottom, and then we have the Canadian Rockies, which are, I go every year, I love the Rockies, very significant in height. The present day Himalaya is really, really super high. And then the early Appalachian Mountains were even higher than that. So that is huge. So you have this massive collision, and it's just forcing up and up and up. And then off of that are coming all kinds of rivers spilling into the Michigan Basin. So sometimes we would have sand coming in, sometimes it was mud, sometimes we'd have calm and quiet times where we had coral reefs developing in the shallow tropical seas. Lots going on, lots of different layers, and that's what's really important about the escarpment. If you look at the diagram on the bottom, you'll see this Michigan Basin, and you see how the layers all kind of gently tilt towards the center of the basin. That center is roughly Flint, Michigan, and it's filling up the basin, filling it up, and then starting, it stopped about 250 million years ago, and since then we've had erosion happening. So if you just keep thinking, really important to understand, different materials were being pumped into the basin. Sand, mud, we had coral reefs developing, we had more mud, etc. And layer upon layer would harden into these wonderful rock layers that form the Niagara Escarpment. Now, I'm being a bit exclusive here because I'm talking about the Niagara Escarpment, that dark brown line, but obviously Peterborough is sitting on some of this old material as well. It's just older than the Niagara Escarpment. It's quite old Paleozoic material, something more like 460, 70, 80 million years old, but it's the same process. There was a pocket, and into it went a whole bunch of mud, and then we had coral reefs, etc. So you were subject to the same kind of thing in your area. Here's another cross section showing the Michigan Basin and all the different layers that are piled up. We can see Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And as I was showing in that other diagram, the Niagara Escarpment goes right up around Manitoulin and then down and separates Lake Michigan from Green Bay. And we have a peninsula very much like our Bruce Peninsula. It just faces the other direction. The escarpment faces west as opposed to east. Now, let's concentrate a little bit on the Niagara Escarpment. Over on the right-hand side in the red square, we have roughly the layers of the Niagara Escarpment. Sorry. All right, I thought that was going to do something different. That's fine. So another diagram here, we're showing the Michigan Basin, and I talk a lot about the Michigan Basin because it's really simple. The geology of the Michigan Basin is super simple. But in fact, there was another low spot before you get to the Michigan Basin. And this is what really complicates things. So if you imagine that the area is sort of in the green butting up against this more, the black and pink colorful area, that's where all those mountain ranges were building up. There was actually another low spot before you got to the Michigan Basin. What's important about this is that if you've ever hiked the Bruce Trail or just driven around on the Niagara Escarpment, there's a very different appearance to the escarpment in the area between Hamilton and Niagara. It's not as high, it's not as hummocky, it's a much flatter, more thinly bedded escarpment. From Hamilton north up to Tobermory, you get a lot more variation in the escarpment, a lot more highs and lows, and the rock layers are more prominent. That's because they're actually from these two different basins. And a lot of the material that was coming off these mountain ranges got trapped in the first basin and the Appalachian Basin and never made it into the Michigan Basin. That's why the Michigan Basin is so easy to talk about. There's just like a few layers, whereas in the Appalachian Basin, from Hamilton to Niagara, there are so many layers. And I'll show you a diagram of that in a second. So there's our two basins, and they roughly intersect in roughly the Hamilton area, right around there. So this is a diagram to show you, how it gets complex. This is the first diagram on the left is a stratigraphic column, right? So we have all the layers stacked up, and we have about 5 main layers, and this is in the Owen Sound area. And I'll go through these layers in a minute so you understand them better. But that's super easy, 5 layers. If we go down to the Waterdown area, we get 7 layers. We have some extra ones that are sort of subbed in here. We've got a beautiful sandstone layer, which is a really important layer on the escarpment. So this is part of that first basin where a lot of the materials fell out and got trapped in that first area. The Whirlpool Sandstone is a good example of one. The Queenston Shale, the bottom layer, the pinkish layer of mud that consolidated into shale, it was very light. And as it spilled into the basin, it was able to carry a long way, and it just sort of covered the whole floor of the basin, of the Appalachian Basin and the Michigan Basin. The sand is heavier than that. So in fact, as that sand was falling out of suspension and being deposited, it actually, as you go farther to the northwest, it gets thinner and thinner. So we have a lovely thick layer of Whirlpool Sandstone down at Niagara Gorge. By the time we get to roughly the Hockley Valley or the sort of the Shelburne area, that formation is gone and we don't have it anymore. And then going further into the Appalachian Basin, this is sort of the Grimsby Hamilton area, we have even more layers. So I'm going to mostly talk about the far left side, but I'll add in a couple of these wacky sublayers as well in the talk. But another factor that kind of complicates things, although it also explains why we have our escarpment. So this is a cross section of southern Ontario, roughly from, well, does it say London over to Trenton? And what you can see are all the layers. And remember, they're all dipping towards the center of the basin. That's because of a little bit of tectonic drawdown, as well as just the layers compressing from, as each layer comes on, it pushes the middle down and creates a little bit of a swale. So you can see that there's a dip in the layers, and they just basically all go from the oldest at the bottom, the Simcoe group, right up to the top, right up to actually Devonian rocks over in London. And they get younger and younger. And this is why actually in southern Ontario, if you go to the west, you go forward in time. And if you go to the east, you go back in time. So Pickering, the rock of Pickering area, the rock of the Peterborough area, is all a lot older than the rock in Toronto, and definitely older than the rock on the Niagara Escarpment. It's beautiful Ordovician rock. It has lots and lots of fossils in it. It's a really great place for fossils, actually. And just another way of showing this, as we go east, we get older rock. As we go west, we get younger rock. But we're going to talk about this red line right here on the edge of the Silurian. That's Niagara Escarpment. So here we go again. We have our Niagara Escarpment at the edge, and I like to simplify it into 3 main layers, right? Like 2 pieces of bread with filling in the middle. And depending on where you are in those 2 basins, will tell you what filling there is. On the bottom, the bottom slice of bread is always Queenston Shale. And on the top is always a dolostone layer. It's called the Lockport from Hamilton to Niagara. It's called the Amabel from Hamilton North. Doesn't matter, it's the same layer, just has a slightly different appearance. Those are the 2 slices of bread. It's the mixed beds are in the middle, and that just all depends on where you are. If you're, say, hiking the Bruce Trail or just exploring the Niagara Escarpment, depending on where you are, you're going to get different beds in the middle. So we'll go through some of these and show you what they look like. So this is the bottommost layer. This is the Queenston Shale, and at the Cheltenham Badlands, which is one of the best exposures of Queenston Shale. And I should say it's called Queenston Shale because it was first studied at Queenston. There's quite a dramatic exposure of this rock in Queenston. That's what's called its type area. So we name rock layers by where they're studied. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the absolute best exposure of that feature, but that's where it was first studied. So Queenston Shale is named for Queenston Heights, where there's a great exposure of it. It's a wonderful muddy shale layer. It was deposited, if you can imagine nowadays, we have the Himalayas rising up, and we have big rivers like the Ganges coming off of the mountains and spilling into the Indian Ocean. A very similar situation happened 450 odd million years ago. We had the same situation with our huge mountain range, and then we had our shallow tropical sea to the northwest, and spilling into the basin were layers of or particles of mud and particles of sand, etc. In this time period, around 450 million years ago, it was red iron-rich mud, and it was very, very light, very fine clay particles, covered the whole bed of the Appalachian and Michigan Basin, and a really, really thick layer. It's red because there was lots of iron in the mountains, and it's oxidized. Where you had those grayish stripes, those were layers that were anoxic. They were not oxidized. This layer is actually on the base of the escarpment throughout the escarpment, but you don't see it unless there's been erosion happening, either oversteepening of a bank, or if you have overstripping through grazing. And that's how these badlands actually were exposed, was grazing about 100 years ago that actually started in a small patch, and then it just took off. So I told you about this, like a big muddy delta. That's the Queenston Shale Delta, building out into our shallow tropical sea. This is some years ago now. Can't do that anymore. Can't walk on the Badlands, but it's really a dramatic feature. It looks like it's pretty smooth and clay-like, but actually, if you cut a nice fresh vertical exposure of it, you can see it's very crumbly and shale-like. People often think shale is hard and platy. On the escarpment, the shale is, for the most part, very soft and clay-like. It's not so hard and platy, except for one particular layer. But the Queenston Shale looks like clay that you'd make pottery out of. And indeed, they do make bricks and pottery out of it. Another exposure, it's at the base of a lot of waterfalls, which is nice. We have a lot of undercutting because the shale's softer, and so it'll undercut some of the harder layers over top. Okay, let's move up into the mixed beds. Down in the water down area, like I said, we had a lot of sand coming in next. After the mud finished, we had sand, and it's formed this wonderful layer called the Whirlpool Sandstone. What I really, really like about the boundary between the Queenston Shale and the Whirlpool Sandstone is that at that point, 444 million years ago, we had a great extinction. It ended the Ordovician and it started the Silurian, and about 60% of life on the planet went extinct at that point in time. So when you're exploring these places and you see the seam between these two layers, it's very significant for our planet. It's a very significant spot. This is a spot at Grindstone Creek in Waterdown near Hamilton, and a big slab of sandstone has fallen from on top of the Queenston Shale. But this is the seam between the Queenston Shale and the Whirlpool Sandstone, and it is a significant time in Earth's history. We had lots of ripple marks in the Whirlpool Sandstone. A little bit hard to see here. You can see some cross bedding, just beautiful geological features in the sandstone. You can sometimes see ripple marks as well. It was an important layer because it was a very prized building material, and University of Toronto, Old City Hall, Queen's Park especially, all of those buildings were built with Whirlpool Sandstone. It had a lot of iron in it as well, so it had a reddish hue, a lot of the beds, and it was a very prized stone. In fact, some of the Whirlpool Sandstone was actually shipped to the Rockies to build Jasper Park Lodge. So a stone is important when it's actually shipped to the Rocky Mountains. This is the entrance to the York Quarry at the side of Forks of the Credit. It's been abandoned. The contract was canceled and everyone walked away. You can still find cables in the woods and rocks ready to be loaded onto a rail siding. It's a very eerie look, but really also quite compelling. Yeah, there's some of the cables that you'll find in the wood. They would winch the rocks down to the train siding, which was some feet below the quarry side. There's also nearby a lime kiln. So they were burning the dolostone rock, the calcium-rich rock, to make lime. But of course, the chimney had to be made of more sturdy stuff. So they made it out of sandstone, which is more resistant to the heat. And so you see beautiful cross bedding in the Whirlpool Sandstone here in this lovely stack at the Hoffman lime kiln. So there's my youngest many years ago sitting on a slab of Whirlpool Sandstone that's fallen at Grindstone Creek. So this is an important feature, actually. This is the very essence of the Niagara Escarpment. What we have are hard layers over top of soft layers. So in this case, we had Whirlpool Sandstone over top of Queenston Shale. But elsewhere in the escarpment, we have other different hard layers on top of shale. And what happens is over time, that shale will erode and the overlying rock will crack and fall. And what that means is you have a nice steep face maintained on the Niagara Escarpment. If the rock was all the same hardness, and we didn't have this sort of super erosion of softer materials, the whole thing would just wear away evenly. But because we have these soft layers underneath hard layers, we do get this nice undercutting and then the creation of that steep face. It's happening all along the edge of the escarpment. It's accelerated where you have waterfalls. It's really beautifully seen at waterfalls and at shorelines, but it's happening along the whole face of the escarpment. So we're back at Grindstone Creek, and at Grindstone Creek, the next layer up is called the Manitou Lindola stone. Now, dolostone is a term that not everyone's heard. A lot of people call the rock of the Niagara Escarpment limestone. It's not limestone, it's actually dolostone, and the difference is dolostone has magnesium in it. Limestone is calcium carbonate, dolostone is calcium magnesium carbonate, and it looks very similar, but it's actually a harder rock. It's better to withstand weathering. So industrially, it's a very important rock as well. There's actually no limestone on the Niagara Escarpment. So I see limestone all the time on signs. It drives me a little bit crazy, and then I get over it because it's a bit nerdy. So here we are. We're still in the mixed beds, and we're up another layer, and we're on the I've just mentioned this about the dolostone. Oh yeah, so this is a kind of a neat feature about the crystals that make up dolostone are calcite and dolomite crystals. So the rock is dolostone, the crystals are dolomite. And if you've heard of rock being called dolomite or heard of the Dolomites in Italy, there's lots of confusion and lots of sort of mixing around the names. In Canada, the geologists are trying to be really clear about it. The rock is dolostone, the mineral is dolomite. So dolomite and calcite make up the rock called dolostone, and they do something very similar. They look different, but they do something very similar. When you fracture them, they fracture into these little rhomboids, which are like cubes that are slightly tilted. And it's a sort of a principle in geology that the micro nature of the rock dictates what it will look like in a macro scale. And sure enough, on the Niagara Escarpment, you will come across many, many places where the dolostone rock has split into these beautiful shapes that mimic the crystals in the rock. Here's a really terrific example. This is near Owen Sound, where you get these wonderful, it's not quite 90 degrees, it's actually 110 degrees and 70 degrees are the angles. But they're everywhere. And once you start to look for them, you'll see them all throughout the escarpment. It's not always, because nature is not that predictable. Sometimes rocks will fall for different reasons along different lines, but predominantly the cracks form along these wonderful straight lines in the dolostone rock. Here's one of my favorite places to look at the Manitou Lindola stone. Is at Rush Cove on the Bruce Peninsula. This is near Lion's Head, and you can see this lovely flat layer. It's got lots of little fossils in it, which is great, but not dramatic ones, but shells and some crinoids and corals and things like that. It's very thin, very platy. It's often referred to as shale. It is not shale. Shale is mud that is consolidated. This is coral reef. It's gone from the coral reef to limestone. All the magnesium in the seawater at the time converted the limestone to dolostone. So another little waterfall in the Blue Mountains area in the Manitou and Dolostone. You can see how thinly bedded it is. It's quite a distinct looking little feature. And it's about, well, it depends on where you are, but it's about maybe 20 feet thick at the most. Here's a great exposure of it. It's about 20 feet, I guess, at Rush Cove, farther along the shoreline. And this is a great example of that process I showed you, where we have undercutting and then rocks falling off. You can see how the waves have undercut the overlying layers, and they've fallen off quite dramatically. So just showing that one again. And that's a really important part of the escarpment formation. So this is just a little example to put some things in context. We started with the Queenston Shale, then we moved up to the Manitou and Dolostone. This is up in the Beaver Valley, There's no Whirlpool Sandstone here anymore. So that layer's gone. Depending, if you go farther north, you won't find it anymore. So we've gone right from Queenston Shale to Manitou and Lindola stone, but that's still the same time period. That yellow line represents the mass extinction at the end of the Ordovician, where 60% of life was wiped out. This is a piece of Manitou and Lindola stone, and I love this little rock. I have it here. I use it for educational purposes. I found it at the shoreline of Hope Bay on the Bruce Peninsula, and I call this my fossil sad face. So this is a rock that has this incredible feature in it, a perfect circle with what looks like two eyes and a mouth frowning. And what it actually is a horn coral, which looks a little bit like a horn of plenty or you know, cornucopia type horn. And we're looking down into it with two smaller horn corals for the eyes and then a brachiopod fossil for the frown. But that's my fossil sad face, and I thought that would interest you. Okay, so we're moving up the beds. The next bed we have is called the Cabot Head Shale, and it's named for Cabot Head on the northern Bruce Peninsula. And it's a feature of shale. It looks very much like the Queenston Shale. You can see it along the shoreline in sort of the middle part of this picture. It's very red and iron rich, just like the Queenston Shale, but it does have more of the anoxic, the non-oxidized layers in it, a lot more green in it, if you will. This is just a piece of gypsum that has formed. We're talking about a deltaic environment. You know, sometimes it was, you know, the mud was above water, sometimes below. So we would get evaporation of mineral salts in the water. So these little nodules of gypsum will form. And the Cabot Head Shale, it looks really muddy and not all that dramatic, but it's this area here where it says Lion's Head, all that mud that's cracked and looking is the Cabot Head Shale. The layer directly atop of that is the Fossil Hill Dolostone. So we went from another muddy influx of material into the basin to a really nice, calm and quiet marine environment where lots and lots of corals and brachiopods lived. And this layer is called the Fossil Hill Dolostone. It's named for Fossil Hill on Manitoulin Island, and it's very rightly named because it is full of fossils. It's fossilicious, as my fossil finding friend would say. I'm standing on a slab of it full of little brachiopod fossils. They look a little bit like bird prints or hoof prints or something like that. But what you can see if you look closely is that if you can imagine a mussel shell that's open and you can see the hinge line, that's the little imprint that you're looking at in the rock. Those are brachiopods. This layer is 430 million years old. And it's full of either these fossils or it's full of corals. This is an example of a Halocyte coral in Fossil Hill Dolostone up near Owen Sound. It's also called chain coral because it looks a bit like a chain if you look at it from, you know, from the top. A really nice example of Halocyte coral. We also have Syringiopora or organ pipe coral, which looks like little tiny pipes. Here's another Syringiopora that was found on a Bruce Trail Conservancy property while I was still CEO. This ended up in the head office on a display as a really beautiful museum quality example of Syringiopora, which is that organ pipe coral. We also had sponges, silica sponges called stromatoporoids. And it's surprising, you'd think a sponge would be more like what I just showed you, this Syringiopora. That's not a sponge, that's a coral. This is actually a sponge. And so it's consolidated into these little layers, almost like cabbage leaf layers. What's important about the sponges of this time period in the Fossil Hill Dolostone is that they were made of silica. They had silica in their bodies as opposed to calcite. So that silica, SiO2, would consolidate, and it's the same chemistry as quartz. It would consolidate into these little nodules of chert, also called flint, also called quartz or chalcedony. Lots of names for the same thing. And those little nodules were actually extracted and made into arrowheads by the indigenous peoples. As the glaciers left the area about 10, 12,000 years ago, they started to actually use this rock and create tools out of these hard little silica nodules in the Fossil Hill Dolostone. There's actually a site near Collingwood, to the west of Collingwood in the Beaver Valley, where they've found these artifacts next to an old, very rudimentary quarry. So that's just a very important industrial layer, if you will. These arrowheads were traded all over the Great Lakes Basin, actually, for several hundred years. This is me pointing to a sponge, and again, it does not look like what you'd probably imagine a sponge would look like, but that is indeed a stromatoporoid sponge from the Fossil Hill Dolostone. So let's go down to Niagara area. This is a layer that does not appear down up north, doesn't appear past Hamilton. This is the Rochester Shale. It's a beautiful shale layer. It's more like what people think of as shale, a little bit harder. It's still pretty muddy though. It goes to mud pretty quickly. What's really great about this layer is that it has trilobites in it. It's one of the very few layers where you can find trilobites more easily. Not as easy as you can find them in the Peterborough, Lindsay, Brecon area, where they have beautiful trilobites out your way, but you can still find them. And this is a Trimeris delphinocephalus, little Silurian trilobite that was found by my mother actually some years ago now. And you often find them without their heads. You just find the body part, or you just find the head, but you don't usually find them together. So this is kind of a nice little trilobite. And it's the only one I've ever found, and I didn't even find it. So, but pretty special for sure. All right, we're moving along, and now we're at the top layer. So we're at the top piece of bread, if you will, of our sandwich of rock. And this is the iconic Niagara Escarpment layer. This is the Amabel Dolostone. It's a thick, whitish layer of rock that you see in several prominent locations. Rattlesnake Point, and this is in the Beaver Valley, Skinner's Bluff as you go north, all along the shoreline of the Bruce Peninsula. You get this lovely thick white layer. Now, it is different from the Fossil Hill Dolostone and the Manitouan Dolostone for a couple of reasons. When those Dolostone layers were being laid down, it was a very calm environment in this shallow tropical sea, very stable. But when the Amabel Dolostone was forming, when these coral reefs were forming, the basin was sinking. There was a tectonic drawdown at some point during its formation. And so instead of the corals just sort of happily spreading laterally and evenly, they started to reach up towards the sunlight. They needed the sunlight. So what you get is these mounds, and it's very different on the Amabel. When you're hiking on the top of the Amabel Dolostone, say on the Bruce Trail, you're going up and down a lot. It's very roly-poly, whereas if you're on the Manitouan or the Fossil Hill Dolostone, nice and flat. So that's a difference in the Amabel. It is, like I said, the iconic layer of the escarpment. There's Mount Nemo. It doesn't have the same fossils as the other two layers. It does have a lot of crinoids in it. Crinoids are also really popular out your way. This is from a drill core showing a really great example of crinoid stems. They're called sea lilies because they had a long stem made up of these little discs and then a frond at the top that would catch all the plankton going by. They looked like a plant, but they were actually an animal. This is a piece of rock near Acton, Ontario, with lots and lots of crinoids in it. This is an Amabel Dolostone full of crinoids. There are crystals found in the rock of the Niagara Escarpment. There's lots of them actually. Beautiful calcite, dolomite crystals, celestite, which is gorgeous blue color, gypsum. That's what we're looking at, some celestite in this rock on the right hand side. But the problem with these crystals is that they are very fragile in from natural weathering. So you really only get them in old quarries. So this crystal that I found, this mineral that I found, was at that old quarry at Forks of the Credit on the hillside, because the rock has only been exposed for about 100 years. And so it hasn't worn away the minerals. Over time, they will wear away. They will. So you don't find really terrific minerals. Sometimes you will, but for the most part, you find them in quarries. I'm just going to quickly go to the modifying effects of the escarpment and clear up some myths there. There's sometimes from time to time people will, I used to lead geology hikes and I'd have people say, oh, the escarpment was formed by glaciation. And I'd say, no, it wasn't. But glaciers did have an important impact on the Niagara Escarpment. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. Up to about 12,000 years ago, the northern part of North America was covered by an ice sheet, the Laurentide ice sheet. And you might think of a glacier as being ice. And well, there's lots of ice in it, but there's also lots of sand and gravel as well. And what's important about that is that as glaciers advance across the landscape, they pick up rocks from other places, sometimes much harder rocks than the local rocks that they end up at. Also, as they melt, they leave those rocks behind. So we call rocks that are left behind by glaciers that don't belong in the local area, we call those erratics. The other effect that glaciers had is that there's lots of valleys that have been carved on the Niagara Escarpment. This is the Beaver Valley, we have Owen Sound, we have a number of valleys on the Bruce Peninsula. They all are aligned in the same direction, and they were all formed because of the glacier, but not by the ice. They were formed by meltwater coming off the ice. And the meltwater was full of these rocks from the Canadian Shield that are much, much harder than the local rock. So they scoured out these terrific valleys like Beaver Valley and Owen Sound. Just a little diagram here, you can see all the alignment of a lot of these valleys very strongly to the northeast. And that was the direction that the ice came from and melted back to as well. Here's the bedrock of the Amabel Dolostone bedrock at Colpoys Bay near Wyerton. And you can actually see the grooves in the rock were from the boulders that were scraping the rock. So Colpoys Bay was carved out by a lot of these big boulders in meltwater, and you can see the scratches on the rock left behind from those big boulders. And there they are, the boulders themselves as well. At the head of Colpoys Bay, you see lots and lots of erratics. Most of the rock in this picture, or at least half of them anyway, are glacial erratics. They're quartz-rich, feldspar-rich boulders from the Canadian Shield that are many, many times harder and more abrasive than the local dolostone rock. And so they've carved it out and carved out some beautiful, beautiful valleys on the Niagara Escarpment. And those erratics get left behind, and I love them because they have all these wonderful minerals in them, particularly garnets, which is something that I always like to look for. And there's a lot of old farmstead ruins along the escarpment. This is a little place near Kimberley in the Beaver Valley, an old barn foundation. And what I love about barn foundations is they're like a geology lesson all in one shot. So you can stand in front of an old barn foundation wall and find a whole bunch of local rocks, and there are local rocks in this barn, as well as erratics, rocks that have been carried there by glaciers and left behind. And sometimes in those rocks, you can see beautiful things like garnets. And this is one of the pieces of beautiful rock from the Canadian Shield that's full of little garnet crystals. They're very small, they're not gem quality, but they're really cool to see in these old barn foundations. A little bit closer, a little bit fuzzy as well. All those little red speckles are little tiny garnets. Here's another erratic that's near Hope Bay. It's a really big one. So the meltwater was very powerful and could move some very large boulders along. This is some time ago, but I'm enjoying spending some time with this boulder. This is a lovely place called Rocky Bay on the Cabot Head, and you can see that the shoreline is just full of erratic boulders. You can just go from one to the other and see volcanic rock and granites and metamorphic rock and all kinds of things. I'll give you a little bit on Georgian Bay itself. So the glaciers left the area of southern Ontario around 12,000 years ago, 10 to 12,000 years ago. They were melting back. And as they were melting back to the northeast, and the meltwater was coming off and filling the Great Lake Basin. And we had glacial Lake Algonquin forming in what is now Georgian Bay. And it was very high water level. And as the glacier melted back, the land in front of it started to rebound. And what happened when the land rebounded, the water was cut off from going into the Great Lakes Basin, and it ended up going down the Ottawa Valley instead. And there was a dramatic drop in the level of the water about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. It was very, very low. And in fact, the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation on the Bruce Peninsula have stories of their ancestors walking to Manitoulin Island. And they're not just stories, because 8,000 years ago, they could have walked to Manitoulin Island. There's artifacts that have been found 150, 200 feet below the water level that shows that the water was very, very low at one time. And again, it's about 8,000 years ago. So I love that intersect of that oral tradition and the actual geology and blending those together. And then the land kind of equilibrated, water started flowing back into the Great Lakes Basin. We had another high-ish Great Lakes stage, and then we have our present level of Georgian Bay. So lots of ups and downs of Georgian Bay in the past, and it's left some really interesting feature. So this is Flower Pot Island, which is roughly at the shoreline of Georgian Bay now. But here's a little flower pot, very similar, very similar. This is near Thornbury, and this is a couple of 100 feet up from the shoreline. So how did this one form? Well, it probably formed during that Nipissing lake level stage. It could have been the Algonquin as well, but one of those higher stages would have formed, the water would have been lapping around at the top. This is at Georgian Peaks, actually, and the water would have been lapping around much, much higher than it is today. We have caves at the shoreline. This is the grotto at Bruce Peninsula National Park. But we also have caves that are quite high and dry now. This is Williams Caves at Lion's Head, are quite significantly up from the shoreline. So they were formed by the pounding of waves in one of those higher lake levels, either 5,000 or 10,000 years ago. Beautiful set of caves near Cave Point on the Bruce Peninsula in Bruce Peninsula National Park. Again, these are high and dry. You can see the trees out the mouth of the cave, and they're quite tall, and we're a good, I don't know, 50, 80 feet up from the level of the lake. Another feature we see on the escarpment are lots and lots of cracks. Remember I told you the crystal shape dictates roughly how the rock will split apart. Those are the lines of weakness. Well, we have water getting into cracks in the rock. Water freezes and expands and pushes the rock apart along these lovely long straight lines. Each year more and more ice gets in, or more and more water, sorry, and it freezes and pushes it apart. And eventually you get these quite large crevices forming. Metcalf Rock is an example on the near Collingwood, a beautiful wide crevice. The rock has split quite far apart. Another beautiful deep crevice at Duncan Escarpment Nature Reserve. So this is, it's actually a combination of that, what's called frost wedging, so the water freezing and pushing apart the rocks, but also the layer below this is the Cabot Head Shale, if you remember all your layers, is the Cabot Head Shale, and it's actually sliding a little bit on the shale as well. And when we had those higher lake levels 5,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, that would have helped sort of lubricate these crevices to widen somewhat. We also have lots of springs on the escarpment. What tends to happen is rainwater will fall on the dolostone, and rainwater can penetrate the dolostone, lots of little cracks as we've just seen. But once it reaches the shale layer below, shale is what's called an aquitard. It does not allow water through it. So the water will actually flow along the top of the shale and emerge as a spring. And these are found all along the escarpment. This is a place called Wodehouse Karst. And there are a number of sinkholes here where actually the water is going into the sinkholes and it trickles down and it hits that shale layer and it comes out as a really rushing spring. I took some kids there. This is almost 10 years ago now, or sorry, almost 20 years ago now. What am I saying? And these kids were homeschooled and they were looking for some geology, and I was happy to oblige. So they were enjoying some of the sinkholes at Wodehouse Karst. But this is a kind of a neat example. So the photograph on the left is something like April of one particular year, 2013, I guess. And you can see there are like many sinkholes in this valley, but they were completely saturated. They could not take the amount of meltwater that was in the area. So a huge lake formed. The picture on the right is in October of the same year, and obviously the sinkholes finally were able to drain all that water, but you can see the trees above my head here with the same trees in this photograph. So big lake and then completely gone once all the sinkholes have done their job, and all that water is flowing down the escarpment from these springs. This is a little shot of what's called Tufa. So this is Manitou and dolostone, actually a lovely, nice, thinly bedded dolostone layer. And there's lots of calcium carbonate in the water. That calcium carbonate will precipitate on the moss that's growing along the stream beds, and it will create a hard crust called tufa. And there are lots of these locations on the Niagara Escarpment in the Beaver Valley section where tufa has formed. Over time, if you get enough tufa forming and you get it really hard and consolidated, you can create travertine. But this is not travertine quality. It's just really crumbly stuff. But it does make a really interesting feature that's kind of unusual if you don't know what's going on there. So I'm going to stop now. I just give you a couple of resources to to explore if you're interested. Way back in 2015, when I was still CEO, I wrote an article in the Bruce Trail magazine called Escarpment Geology, another part of our living landscape. And the address is there, but if you sort of look up Bruce Trail Geology, you'll probably get a link to this little article. I'm also working on a book on the escarpment. I'm starting with the Beaver Valley section, which is why you saw a lot of Beaver Valley pictures in the presentation. It's a book that talks about the geology in general and then goes into specific detail on various hikes. And I'm hoping that's going to be ready the end of 2022, maybe spring 2023. So another resource for escarpment geology. And thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.